Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 25 April 2024. It is the 495th anniversary of the birth of Franciscus Patricius, who was born on this date in 1529. Patricius is sometimes known by the Italian version of his name, Francesco Patrizi, and sometimes known by the Croatian version of Franjo Petriš. And it's been translated in several different ways, but I'm going to use the Latinate form of Franciscus Patricius. It's difficult to find translations of Patricius' works into English, but he wrote a number of works relevant to philosophy of history, though I only know about these through the secondary literature. One of his works is called the Peripatetic Discussions, which is a critique of Aristotle. Patricius was part of the Renaissance reaction against Aristotle. Aristotle had dominated scholastic philosophy for hundreds of years, and one way for Renaissance philosophers to distance themselves from this tradition was to attack the authority and the theories of Aristotle. In my episode on philosophy of history before Augustine, I discussed some of Aristotle's views on time and how these imply a philosophy of history that isn't ever made explicit. Relevant to that, there's a 2005 paper by Eugene E. Ryan titled Reflections on Light and Time in the Philosophy of Franciscus Patricius, and in the 1905 paper of Albert Einstein, The Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies. The author in this paper explicitly formulates a number of Aristotelian theses on times that Patricius rejected, citing both Patricius's Aristotelian discussions and the Nova de Universis Philosophia. While Renaissance Platonism was a thing, especially in the works of Marsilio Ficino, a generation before Patricius, Patricius doesn't seem to have taken the Platonic approach on time, which is the denial of the reality of time. In my episode on Simone Weil, I touched on the possibility of a Platonic philosophy of history, so this is one alternative to Aristotle, but this wasn't the alternative to Aristotelianism but Patricius pursued. According to Ryan, Patricius has an alternative conception of time distinct from that of Aristotle. Given the rejection of Aristotle and the rejection of an Aristotelian conception of time, it is likely that a different implicit philosophy of history could be formulated on the basis of this alternative conception of time that Ryan hints at in the paper on Patricius. If you think it's a little strange that a Renaissance philosopher should be mentioned in connection with Einstein, it gets stranger. There's a paper by Paul Richard Blum, Francesco Patrizi on the time sack, History and Rhetorical Philosophy, in which Blum not only discusses Patricius, but also H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. He even discusses a sequel to Wells' The Time Machine by Egon Friedel, which I hadn't previously heard of, so that was new to me. As unlikely as this sounds, it is nevertheless highly relevant to philosophy of history. Blum attributes to Patricius the idea that history includes the future along with the past. Quote, memory also includes the future, not only the past. The idea is elucidated via the concept of prophecy. For just as history is the discussion of past deeds and events, so prophecy treats of the same things but in the future. But the essence of the argument is that history, as memory, suspends time, unquote. Blum also wrote a 2019 paper, History and Theory, The Paradox of Francesco Patrizi, which summarizes the content of Patricius's main contribution to history, which is 10 dialogues on history, Della Historia, 10 dialoghi, from which I quote this passage from the Blum paper. Quote, the first dialogue establishes that history is narration, specifically narration of things done by humans. As such, it is subject to rhetorical structures like beginning, order, purpose, as well as judgments concerning what to say and what to omit, or what to avoid and what to elaborate. At the center is the persistent query, what is history? To this, the second dialogue responds with a survey of the variety of histories. The third dialogue raises in the title the main question regarding its essence. Dialogues 4 and 5 address the purpose and truth of history. Dialogues 6 and 7 differentiate universal history from particular history, followed in the 8th dialogue by a consideration of biography. The book concludes with the dialogues on the usefulness and validity of history, unquote. We get a hint of the character of the dialogue from a quote embedded in William Stenhouse's 2012 paper, Panvinio and Descriptio, Renditions of History and Antiquity in the Late Renaissance. Quote, in 1560, Francesco Patrizi of Cherso wrote Della Historia 10 Dialoghi set in Venice, in which he investigated contemporary historical practice, including the media that historians could use. And then there's an embedded quote, what are carved on the columns of Trajan and Antoninus and on the arches of Constantine and Severus, if not the histories of their victories and triumphs, close embedded quote. He asked, I would add that history may not only be written, but also sculpted and painted, and there are more properly historii, for they are objects of sight. He went on to add that they are also truly narrations of events. Just as Patrizi knew of developments in antiquarianism, Panvinio certainly would have known Patrizi's book, if not the author, unquote. This passage, I will note, is very modern in its recognition of material culture as a source for history. So Patricius here is already anticipating what I've mentioned in the episode on Leonard Woolley as the auxiliary sciences of history. There is also a chapter on Patricius in Paul Oscar Christeller's 8 Philosophers of the Italian Renaissance, which mentions his work on history. Quote, Patrici's treatises on poetics, rhetoric, and the art of history obviously belong together, for the 3 subjects were linked in the theoretical literature of the 16th century, and already before then in the program the Studia Humanitatis. Although the humanists did not produce many separate treatises on these subjects with the exception of rhetoric. Patrici's Art of History, Della Historia, 1560, is interesting as a contribution to a genre that was still fairly new at the time, and that may be considered as the first beginning of later literature on the methodology and philosophy of history. The most famous and influential author to write on this subject in the 16th century was Jean Bodin, whose treatise was published several years after that of Patrizi, 1566. More important is Patrici's Poetics, of which he published only 2 sections, Della Poetica, 1586, 5 more remaining in manuscript. This work, which is composed in dialogue form, occupies a special position in the voluminous literature on the subject that was produced in 16th century Italy. For Patrizi carries his anti-Aristotelian bias into a field which had been dominated by Aristotle's poetics for several decades, and which was still to be dominated by it far into the 17th and 18th century, not to speak of the attempted revival in our own time, often referred to as the Chicago School of Criticism. Patrizi's aim was to dethrone Aristotle and to construct other poetics that was partly another poetics that was partly original and partly based on Plato, and an attempt has not yet sufficiently been studied, unquote. Julian H. Franklin discusses Patricius's skepticism in his book Jean Bodin and the 16th Century Revolution and the Methodology of Law and History, which identifies the position of Patricius as historical Pyrrhonism, which Franklin defines as the position that historical knowledge is impossible. Pyrrhonism is named for the 4th century BC Greek philosopher Pyrrho of Elis, who formulated a particularly thoroughgoing kind of skepticism that has since been known as Pyrrhonism. Skepticism was common among Renaissance humanists and Platonists, but Patricius seems to have been among the few philosophers to apply this skepticism to history. Here is a quote from the Franklin book. Quote, the historian, begins Patrizi, was either contemporary with the action or was not. And in the latter case, his veracity is hardly worth discussing. He may or may not have distorted what he learned, but even granted his integrity, he is clearly dependent on the truthfulness of others. For whether the past be recent or remote, there is nothing that can be known of it but what our forebears have transmitted through their writings. In the first distinction, therefore, that between original and secondary authors, the issue of historical veracity is narrowed to the prime observer. But this original observer, notes Patrizi, will either be a party to the action or a neutral, and in the former case, he will have the strongest motives to distort. He will either vilify his enemies from hatred, glorifies his party from affection, keep silent on his hidden interests, or perhaps do all of these together. The partisan observer, therefore, is so very likely to have lied that everything depends upon the neutral. The difficulty here, however, is that a neutral reporter is not very likely to be knowledgeable. Unattached to either party, he will not have been privy to their counsels and must depend on what the actors tell him. These, however, are not very likely to reveal themselves to neutrals, as is especially clear in the behavior of the prince who is in possession of the secrets of the state. The prudent ruler, hold Patrizi, is a natural enemy to truth, since the basis of his power is cunning, while his authority depends on reputation. If he communicates his secrets, it is normally to confidants and servants who have every motive to preserve them in affection, interest, and fear. It is very likely, therefore, that the honest neutral, even granting his existence, will know only the outcome of an action and not the inner motivations on which the value of a history depends, unquote. This kind of skepticism of the very possibility of historical knowledge may be compared to Descartes' well-known dismissive attitude to history expressed in the Discourse on Method. In my episode on Descartes, I characterized his work as a non-philosophy of history for this reason. And Patricius is, if anything, more explicit and more radical than Descartes. In his 10 dialogues on history, which were written a generation before Descartes was born, he is very specifically skeptical of the whole problem of history rather than merely being dismissive of it as Descartes was. We could say that Descartes is neutral or dismissive, but Patricius was openly critical. Jean Bodin, who lived from 1530 to 1596, and there was therefore a very close contemporary of Patricius, may have written his Method for the Easy Composition of History, published in 1566, in response to Patricius's historical skepticism. So here's the opening paragraph of Bodin's Method. Quote, "Of history, that is, the true narration of things, there are three kinds, human, natural, and divine. The first concerns man, the second nature, the third the father of nature. One depicts the acts of man while leading his life in the midst of society. The second reveals causes hidden in nature and explains their development from earliest beginnings. The last records the strength and power of mighty God and Almighty God and of the immortal souls set apart from everything else. In accordance with these divisions arise history's three accepted manifestations. It is probable, inevitable, and holy. And the same number of virtues are associated with it, that is to say, prudence, knowledge, and faith. The first virtue distinguishes base from honorable, the second, true from false, the third, piety from impiety. The first, from the guidance of reason and experience of practical affairs, they call the arbiter of human life. The second, from inquiry into abstruse causes, they call the revealer of all things. The last, due to love of the one God toward us, is known as the destroyer of vice. For these three virtues together is created true wisdom, man's supreme and final good. Men who in life share in this good are called blessed, and since we have come into the light of day to enjoy it, we should be ungrateful if we did not embrace the heaven-offered benefit, wretched if we abandon it. Moreover, in attaining it, we derive help from history in its three phases, but more especially from the divine form, which unaided can make mankind happy, even though they have no experience of practical affairs and no knowledge of secret physical causes. Yet if the two latter are added, I believe they will bring about a great increase in human well-being," unquote. In chapter 8 of this same work by Bodin, Method for the Easy Comprehension of History, which is titled A System of Universal Time, Bodin lays out the importance of chronology for history. Quote, "Those who think they can understand histories without chronology are as much in error as those who wish to escape the windings of a labyrinth without a guide. The latter wander hither and thither and cannot find any end to the maze, while the former are carried along the many intricacies of the narrative with equal uncertainty and do not understand where to commence or where to turn back. But the principle of time, the guide for all histories, like another Ariadne tracing the hidden steps with a thread, not only prevents us from wandering, but also makes it possible for us to lead back erring historians to the right path. We see all very good writers have so much regard for time as to include not only the years, but even the separate parts of the year. Others do not admit even the very months and the days for the moments of the days in which a thing has happened, because they understand that without a system of time, hardly any advantage is culled from history, unquote. Baudin takes this chronological imperative in a suitably radical philosophical sense in his book. And in this chapter that I just quoted from, inquires into the origins of the world and whether history has a beginning and an end. And this is similar in some respects to the more philosophical sections on historical time in Augustine's City of God. Radical skepticism, as in historical Pyrrhonism, must be answered by an equally radical philosophical response if it's going to effectively address the source of the skepticism. We could say that Baudin had a rational response, which was radical in its own way, radical in its extrapolation and its application. But Baudin's rationalism wasn't a response to the specific epistemic problems that face historical knowledge and which were the target of Patricius's criticisms. Descartes, on the other hand, had a radical philosophical response, but he remained skeptical that his response was applicable to history. The whole, we speak of modern philosophy beginning with Descartes because of the what is sometimes called the epistemic turn, the turn from the central problems that preoccupied scholastic metaphysics to the problem of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And Descartes would found all of that on the axiom, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. So Descartes had a radical response to philosophical skepticism, but he didn't apply it to history. And since he was uninterested in history, he didn't really offer us any hints about how we might go about rationally reconstructing knowledge in the way that he tried to rationally reconstruct knowledge in the sciences. I would say it is emblematic for the problems that face a philosophy of history that the skeptical criticisms of historical knowledge have never been fully or satisfactorily answered. And this means that Patricius's skepticism remains a live option even for us today, 500 years later. However, the ancient Pyrrhonists held out as their ideal state of skepticism a complete suspension of judgment. And this suspension of judgment also had a moral correlate in the state of ataraxia, which was an ideal that was equally admired by Stoics and Epicureans. An ideal of tranquility, of being completely unperturbed by anything that happens. We can compare the Pyrrhonists' ideal state of suspension of government, ideal state of suspension of judgment to what phenomenologists attempt to do, which Husserl sometimes called the bracketing of the world or the bracketing of existence. So as you take everything you know or believe about the world and you just set it aside, but the world is still there and you still examine it for what it is, but it has been changed by this phenomenological perspective on things, if it is possible. Also, obviously, there's no philosophical consensus on that, but that is the conceit of the phenomenological method, is to be able to do that and be able to achieve essentially the Pyrrhonist ideal state of suspension of judgment and still go forward from that point. In fact, that's the beginning point for phenomenology. So to me, this implies that there could still be a phenomenological philosophy of history, even given a Pyrrhonic suspension of judgment. And this could be taken as a sufficiently radical epistemic response to historical skepticism or to Patricius's historical Pyrrhonism. So happy birthday, Franciscus Patricius, and thanks for listening.